Okay, can I ask Joe and John to also show your video? And then I will start going through some of these questions. We've got some great questions today. Thank you so much. I'll start with a couple that I can answer, and then I'm going to pass them over to John and then ask some of Joe as well. So we have one question here, which is, would you tend to miss the feral dog population if you stick to the streets? There might be dogs which are more shy that you would miss if you only stick to the streets. That's definitely a possibility. If you have in a quite an urbanized area, my experience has been that if you go bright and early in the morning before people are active, you'll see most of the dogs are associated with the streets, even if they tend to not be visible during the day when people are more active. However, if you've got open areas where feral dogs tend to be living, and they're very rare, feral dogs, so you're in a special place if you've got them. But if you have those open areas, you can of course include those in your survey as well, potentially using a polygon instead of a transect, or use a transect across, crisscrossing that area. Also consider that when you're doing an index, when you're running a survey that's to get an index of the population, you're not trying to see every dog or every cat, you're just trying to see a proportion of them and put the same consistent effort into finding that proportion, so that your index then acts to tell you how the wider population is changing. So the fact that you miss some might not always be a problem, unless it's a very specific subpopulation of dogs that you want to try and capture in a different way. There was another question here about, when you develop your survey, would it make sense to target wards by socioeconomic condition? That's a good question. That's about sampling really, and you've got a couple of options there. Also, issue of whether you want to pick up wards with differences in human density. If you're taking a relatively large random sample, you should have differences in socioeconomics and human density anyway, if your sampling has been done well. And then you can look after the event at whether human density or socioeconomics can predict the density of dogs that you found in those wards. So you can do some post-survey analysis to see whether those are in fact useful predictors. Of course, if you are concerned that your random sample will not pick up a good enough array of human density or socioeconomics, then you can stratify your sample and make sure that you are picking up wards across that variability. I think I'll pop over to John now with a question, which has come up a couple of times, which is about when we might have an iPhone version of the app available.
Good question. I don't know when. It really does depend on funding. So if there's anyone out there that knows of a great funding source or has deep pockets themselves, then let Ellie know. Just a bit of background on why we only have Android. Part of that is funding, resources, accessibility to other developers. 90% of our projects are outside of the US, where the most popular platform is Android. The reverse seems to be true inside the US, but currently, as far as I know, Joe's project is probably the only one we have or had. So yes, I'd love to create an iPhone app, but it's on the to-do list for sure.
Soon, we hope. And then we had another question, John, that I wanted to put to you, which is the idea of including visuals as part of the app. So being able to take photos or videos. Could you answer that one for us as well?
Yeah, so that one has I think a longer answer. Partially, it's a philosophical design intent decision. This app, the intention of this app is to survey, not to manage a process or be tactical in that way. So making the app run on as small a footprint as possible, be as fast as possible, what was part of the design that went into the design decisions. There's a very practical component to this as well. If you take photos, you need to store those photos on both the phone, you need to store them on the server, we need to upload them and certainly in environments where internet speed is quite low, so that would definitely have an impact on the performance of the app. Currently, the data that we collect and upload is very compact. You know, we're talking about a few kilobytes of information each time you upload a survey. Having said that, there is a workaround. You can take photos outside of the app and use the GPS associated with the photo to associate it with the sighting in the survey. I mean, it's a few extra steps that you're going to have to go through, but it's certainly possible now. It's just not integrated.
Good point.
So,
thank you, John. That's great.
right.
I'd like to ask some questions of Joe now. I understand you actually did measure cat detectability through your surveys as well, and I wondered if you could describe a bit of how you did that.
Yeah, I actually didn't do it. We contracted with a biostatistician who knows a lot more about statistics than I do, but we ended up using a modeling method called N mixture models. And basically you need to do repeated surveys in the same area. And that model allows you to take abundance data based on repeated surveys to develop a detection error estimate. And I think our detection error estimate for all years hovered around 50%. So that kind of goes back to that question earlier when, you know, someone was asking about, you know, you might not be seeing all the cats or animals that you're trying to detect, which is the whole reason for doing the detection probability estimate in the first place, so you can correct your population estimate if you want to get an exact number rather than a trend. But that seemed to work well for us. And I know that that modeling method, even though I don't know a lot about it, the mechanics of how it works, is you know, widely used in the scientific community right now. And so it seems to be well vetted. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Jay. That's great. I also wanted to ask you another question, which is, you use citizen scientists, you use volunteers to do your survey. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about training them for Talea and any top tips you have on doing that well.
Sure, yeah. We put our volunteers, Audubon volunteers, and our feral cat coalition volunteers together, which was kind of cool to get two different communities of volunteers to kind of interact and create some connections. But what we did is we initially did virtual trainings online, where I went in detail for about an hour. You know, you want to keep these trainings not too long for people that are volunteering their time, and just went through the Talea app, kind of what like Ellie did today, but really focusing in on the methods that we do on the ground, the kinds of data we want to collect. And then I also created some sandboxes for people to use in their own communities. So Portland, you know, obviously is a big city. And again, we want to try to make it as easy for volunteers as possible. So I created, you know, very simple transects around city blocks in the different quadrants of the city, so people wouldn't have to travel far to go and test the app. They could also test it right from their house, but they wouldn't have a transect to follow. But if they wanted to follow a specific transect and test it out, more like it would be when they were doing an actual survey, they could, you know, drive to an area and do a test survey, and then follow up with questions if they had any with me. And that worked out pretty well. When we arrived at the site to do the actual surveys, we did them 3 consecutive Sundays. Sundays were a good day because people weren't working and volunteers had the time to do it. I would run through the protocol again with everybody, and then split people into groups. And I tried to put experienced observers in each group. And of course, one observer in those groups had to have an Android phone. And that was a challenge, as John mentioned. In the US, a lot of people use iPhones, but we were able to get enough people. So we had nine plots where we would split people into groups of 2 or more people. And the one person that had the Android would collect the data, and the other people would spot the cats and you know, field questions from the public, because people in the public would often be like, "What are you guys doing?" And we had brochures to hand out. But by the time we finished our project, we did it for 8 years. We had really worked hard to work with the community, and most people knew what we were doing. And we actually, one of the homeowner association in the manufactured home community, which is where we had most of the cats, they actually formed their own kitty committee, and they would educate their community about what's going on with the project. So I hope that helps.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. We did have one question where someone was describing how they do sterilisation interventions in remote areas where they spend a week or so it's not possible for them to do the frequent surveying. And actually, I was sort of thinking about what you've done there, and one potential solution to that is that you actually train someone within that remote community to do the survey, because if they have an Android phone, then they can do surveys whenever they have the time to do it. So I'm always really pleased to look back at that work that you did, and there's nothing special about being an observer. You just need a bit of time and a bit of training, and you can get some great data from them.
Absolutely.
I've got a couple more questions I'll go through here. So we have one where we have someone describing, Karina, who's describing working with spay neuter campaigns for a year and a half. They've done more than 3,500 sterilizations in that area. Very good. But we don't have any previous studies of the population. Do you think we can still do a survey now and continue in the next months of years to control and evaluate our work there? 100% you can. Obviously, getting a baseline before you start is the best, but it's never too late. And the fact that you are only 1.5 years into that intervention, and it's a spay neuter intervention, it may well be that you were unlikely to see very significant changes, at least in the density of the roaming dogs and cats within that year and a half. It tends to take a little bit longer for that decline to kick in. You may have seen changes in lactating females and puppies or kittens in that early period, but maybe not a change in density. So of course, the earlier you can get out there and take that data, the better. But if we, think back to that data I showed you from India in Jaipur, they've been doing that for 28 years now. I think they're on. This is decades of work. So do start as soon as you can. Start with something that's realistic and reasonable, and commit yourself to keep repeating those surveys over the long term. And that's where you get some real learning, and you can get some good evidence of long-term impact. Another question we had, kind of a quick one here from Irene. She was talking about big-bellied pregnant females, and would you categorize her as lactating? You can do what you like with your categories, so long as all of your observers agree with the same. Personally, I would have a category for lactating, and if you want to record pregnant females as well, then have a separate category for them. My experience has been that those big-bellied pregnant females are not always that obvious to see, so they end up being quite a low percentage of the total. Rather, the lactating females are visible as lactating for a longer period of time, so they tend to make up a bigger percentage of the population. So I've tended not to worry too much about recording them. The key thing is you don't want one person saying, I'm going to record her as lactating, and someone else saying, I'm going to record her as just normal, non-lactating, because she's actually pregnant instead. You need everyone to agree. So it's that observer reliability that really matters there. We have one question here from Maria about, do you recommend to perform the survey during 2 periods of the day, in the morning and the evening, or is it only one enough? If you can do it twice a day, if you have that capacity, that's great. Sometimes they're quite different populations of animals in the morning and in the evening. My experience of doing surveys multiple times a day, I've pretty much always found the morning has the highest density, middle of the day not so many, and sometimes you get a peak in the evening as well. My experience has been those tend to be the owned roaming, because it's when people come home from work and they let their dog out, if you're in one of those countries where that is a normal thing to do. So I've tended to always go to the morning, because that's when you see the most. But if you want to do the PM as well, and you have that capacity, that's great. One thing I will say is that if I had the time to do certain amount of surveying, I would do a morning survey and replicate it and do it twice, rather than spend my time doing a morning and an evening. The replication at the same time of day is really, really valuable to get that measure of day-to-day variation. That really does help when you get to your statistics later on. Tamara, we've got a question here about in which month was the, I'm going to wreck this name, Chisnu survey performed? That's not
Chisnu?
That might be it.
I'll see it. Let me see.
Yeah, I think that's right. Which month was it performed?
That was in November.
Okay, so it was starting to go into the winter time. So that might
early November, yeah.
Might have been why you didn't see many lactating females and puppies at that time. Possibly.
Interestingly, people were telling me that they see the puppies actually when it's really, really cold outside. And we saw a lot of breeding going on. So lots of females in heat, which we didn't record, obviously. But so lots of breeding behavior going on. And then when they told us that when it's really cold, they see a lot of puppies, that made sense.
Okay.
So yeah, I think we were not there when it was puppy season. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then we had another question here on collars and whether collars are a reliable indicator of ownership in dogs. And this attendee was saying they know that in some countries, dog welfare advocates are putting high visibility fluorescent collars on street dogs to make them more visible to traffic so they don't get hit by cars, which sounds like an interesting intervention. But you need to take that into account. And I absolutely agree, if you are trying to use collars as an indicator of ownership, and then there's a separate intervention that's increasing the use of collars, that might be collars to show that dogs are being vaccinated, for example, then that collar is telling you a different story. Just to say, in the Soy Dog Project in Thailand, they decided to go for quite a generic definition of signs of ownership. So if a dog has a collar on or is wearing a t-shirt, that's the thing they do in Thailand. They put t-shirts on the dogs, or there was a bowl of water put out for it, or a bowl of food, or some kind of shelter had been built. All of those were indicating a sign of ownership. Now, they weren't using that as a definition of sort of legal ownership as an individual household, referral household taking ownership of that dog, but some kind of, they have a strong sense of community ownership over some of these dogs. And just interesting, sort of a side point really, over the period of their CMVR project, the proportion of dogs that show signs of ownership have increased dramatically. You've got to the point now where nearly every dog on the street has some kind of sign that someone is caring for it, so has that kind of community ownership oversight going on.
Yeah, if I may just add something as well, I think that this is like an indicator that you, as you just mentioned, I think you have to be very careful around as well, because that's not all of the dogs that have an owner. Most of the dogs that are roaming and have an owner not necessarily wear a collar. So as you said, they have like a water bowl, or you see them each morning in front of the exact same gate. They're always hanging out there. They have almost like a little, like a little sleeping area where they always sleep. That might be an indicator that they are just sleeping there in the morning. And when they come back from work, they go in again or something. So yeah, it's a bit tricky around ownership, I think, but it's something to start with, at least, if it makes sense, I guess.
Thank you. I've got a quick question here that the data that you presented was generated by Talea. Is that right, Tamara?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
When you say generated and data, which, I mean, everything was collected in Talea and everything was output from Talea, yes.
Yeah, I think that was the question. That's good. And then I've got one more here that's a question that I don't have a very precise answer for, but it's a very common question, which is how to create an unbiased route. So how much of the area do you include in that unbiased route? Do you do it by a total percentage of road or a percentage of the total area? This is always challenging, because in environments where the population of animals is very variable, they cluster a lot, and there's areas where there's none and there's areas where there's lots, then you do need a reasonably large sample to capture all that variation. If you're in a city where there is more even density across the whole city, then you can get away with a lower sample, a smaller sample. The reality for most of the dogs and cats is that they are pretty clustered, and so you do need to try and capture a decent variation, a decent amount of the roads to capture all that variation. So I'm gonna go for, it would be fabulous if you can cover 20% of the streets. I commonly don't get to that in the surveys that I've worked with. We've normally landed somewhere just above 10. And the larger your sample, the more reliable your estimate will be. But if you're if you're using an unbiased route to get a kind of a rough judge of numbers at the beginning, try and get over 10%, getting towards 20 if you have the time. But if you can at least get 10% of the roads, then you're hopefully getting close to capturing that, that variation in the dog or cat density. The main thing is to make sure that you're covering different road types, different community types. Get on Google Earth, look at where residential and industrial areas are, and capture that variation in the environment within your route, rather than think too much about the percentage. We've got to the very end now of our presentation, or our time rather, for this webinar. So I just want to thank the presenters today. Thank you for sticking with us for the Q&A at the end. All the presentations from today and the Q&A sessions will end up on that Talea webinar webpage, so you can always catch up on this another time. Thank you all for attending, and good luck in your surveying. Let us know how it goes. We're looking forward to hearing from you.